While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 bodies buried on her property. Susan was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. And then out of the car popped 3 young people. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm. They had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring, and initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard, he kept to himself, but Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Apparently, one of his kids had been assaulted and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. Robert one day just walked right up to her shack. He handed her an envelope filled with cash and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car. She didn't know who was in the car with him, and then the car turned around and drove out of sight. And since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog. The kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. They asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" Investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month. The investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously, this was very suspicious, and right away, the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. A few days later, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property. They told her, "Hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance." And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, "Hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately." She turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, "Okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you." And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. And she says to the sheriff, "He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after." Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up, but Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. As the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, "Has anyone died on your property?" The story that Susan would tell was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. She told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground. She realized they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, got a shotgun, and Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream. She was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. The results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn, and so finally the investigators just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm, and if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble. Susan kind of stopped fidgeting, and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back, and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it, and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators, and she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. About a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delicino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard, but at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. There was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen, and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.